So today we're going to look a bit at Canada in the world, or Canadian foreign policy in brief. So this is something we like to include, a bit of a more outward-looking discussion of Canadian foreign policy. But I should note that this is going to be this super quick version. There's an entire class you can take on Canadian foreign policy. So I recognize it's going to be incomplete, but I just want to give you an overview of some of the key developments. So again, we're going to go to the timeline. All right, so let's start. This time our timeline starts 1931. Obviously, you could pick any time to start. There's just so much going on. But let's start in 1931. Statute of Westminster, you might know that from your high school history class. The idea that it made Canada and some other countries that had been British colonies at some point in time, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, for example, quote, fully independent dominions equal in status but closely associated with the mother country, i.e. Britain, and it became part of the British Commonwealth of Nations. So what did this mean practically? It meant that the Canadian ambassador didn't have to be introduced by the British ambassador. It meant that Canada could organize or could join some international organizations that didn't necessarily recognize dependencies, so like the Pan American Postal Union, which everybody wants to be a part of. And also, I mean, the key thing that we talk about is that it solidified Canada's right to conduct independent external relations. And the case in point for that is, of course, 1939. Canada declares war on Germany 7 days after Britain and France do. Canada did have to essentially to go to war on Britain's side, but it was a delay, and it was a symbolic gesture of independence, of the fact that Canada could produce their own foreign policy. So we get World War II. Obviously, Canada has. You're probably taking history courses that will explain a lot of Canada's contributions in World War II. Kind of the next thing, though, that I wanted to talk about was post-World War II in 1945, we get the United Nations Charter. And so let's take a quick look. Canada was one of the original signatories to the United Nations Charter. So let's take, I don't have internet here, though, so you're going to have to go and take a look at the Article 1 at least, or read as much as you can of the United Nations Declaration. And we're going to talk about a few questions. So go take a look at that, and then come back and we will chat further about it. So the first question we want to ask is, well, what was the original purpose of this? Canada was involved in it, so what was the purpose? And I kind of identified two major ones. So one, we're coming out of World War II. So think about that in that context. So Canada is thinking about, first of all, we want global peace, and the UN is seen as potentially one way to do that. We knew that we had the League of Nations prior. It didn't exactly do much to solve world peace issues. We got World War II. So the idea was, okay, let's, once and for all, build an international organization that can help us secure world peace. Okay, and then the second part is about solving international problems. So we saw huge human rights issues. We saw huge humanitarian issues post-World War II. And so the idea was, we're going to build an international organization that can address these economic, social, and cultural issues together. Does it still fulfill these purposes? Has it secured world peace? Not really, but not no either. We haven't had World War III, but we also, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's the UN that prevented that, but that's a big counterfactual that we can't necessarily know. Has it worked on solving issues of economic, social, cultural issues? Yeah, there's a lot of great work that the UN has done on those particular issues. But what other organizations are fulfilling these purposes? So in terms of peace and security, the easy one to look to would be NATO. Has kind of filled that role of international peace and security throughout the Cold War and post-Cold War II. You can look at, for example, the G7 being the big group that's looking at economic issues, and there's a variety of other international organizations that are fulfilling some of these roles originally envisioned for the UN. So obviously, it's still up for debate whether it's fulfilling these purposes, and if not, who else is filling those. But that's something definitely to take a look at, and there will be a question on that in the quiz. So let's talk post-World War II. Canada signs on to NATO, which is obviously very important. Especially for you guys as officer cadets, you're going to be at some point in time probably involved in NATO actions. So the idea behind NATO, of course, and I assume you already all know this, you get the Cold War, this idea that the United States wanted an alliance of countries to prevent Soviet aggression, that in the big part of the the NATO Charter being that, an attack against one is an attack against all. Canada also added its own little Article 2. Article 2 is called the Canada Article usually, sometimes, and it calls for social and economic cooperation as well among members. So yeah, we're interested in collective security, but we should also do some social and economic cooperation in NATO. And so this for Canada sees a shift from our main foreign policy ties being with Britain to our main foreign policy ties being with the United States, a relationship that most would argue continues to this day. If you don't know what NATO is, because you probably should, considering what you guys are going to be when you grow up. So here's a little quick video about some of the basics of NATO that I think you should probably take a look at. So pause the video, take a look at that, and then come back. All right, so let's move forward. 1950s in the Suez Crisis. Again, something hopefully you've covered in a history class before. The idea that there was obviously this conflict emerging in Egypt at Suez Canal, and Louis Saint Laurent refused to unilaterally support United Kingdom's position and support the UK or Great Britain in this conflict. So Saint Laurent says to his external affairs minister, Lester B. Pearson, who goes on to become prime minister eventually, can you go in and help find a solution? And so Pearson comes up with this peace plan that suggests that the United Nations have an emergency force that can be deployed. The idea is that this force will be under Canadian command and will be comprised of a bunch of neutral states that are not directly involved in the conflict. And the idea is that the General Assembly is going to support them, the General Assembly of the UN, and the idea that, we're going to keep the borders at peace until we can work out a political settlement. So we're going to go in, we're going to make sure that nothing happens, and you guys can work out your political settlement. And this is widely considered to be the beginning of global peacekeeping operations. And Canada has, as a result, oftentimes been associated with peacekeeping. So let's take a closer look at peacekeeping. Another video. So take a look, pause the video, and there's a large number of questions that we're going to talk about how peacekeeping has evolved and what it actually means. So pause and then come back. All right, so welcome back. So let's go through these questions that I have about Canada and peacekeeping. So first of all, what is peacekeeping? There's a few principles. So monitoring a peace that has already been declared, being there to maintain that peace. So the idea is that, two sides of a conflict have decided, okay, we're not going to fight anymore, we're going to work out a political agreement, but we need somebody to step in just to make sure that the peace stands. The original idea of peacekeeping being to be a stand between or someone just to keep the peace, essentially, while these additional political considerations and rebuilding is happening. So it's argued in this video, at least, that Canada's very well suited to peacekeeping, just like how Pearson had originally said, Canada would be a great country to be leading the Suez emergency force, because it's seen as a neutral state. It doesn't kind of have the baggage of colonialism. It's a middle power. So middle power being, we're not one of the superpowers of the world. We're not, the the USA, but we do have some might that we can kind of back up what we're doing. And also, that we are a multicultural society, so we can work in a variety of different contexts. We understand what that can look like. So it's argued, at least in this video, that Canada was seen to be very well suited to the peacekeeping initiatives. And the thing that changed, though, in peacekeeping in the former Yugoslavia was that peacekeeping itself started to change. It wasn't necessarily maintaining a peace that already existed, but it was essentially trying to stop a civil war from breaking out, trying to stop terrorist attacks, and preventing terrorism. And it became more like a combat mission and less about actually trying to keep a peace that already existed. It was almost like peace building as opposed to peacekeeping. And so that was a huge change, that traditional peacekeeping that we like to talk about wasn't necessarily always going to be what was needed. So the Trudeau government has said that we need to go back to peacekeeping, that it needs to be a modern peacekeeping that includes troops, humanitarian intervention, diplomats. So it's more of a comprehensive, one could even say whole of government approach to peacekeeping. So the idea that peacekeeping is not just sending in a bunch of troops and keeping the peace, but it's also about rebuilding society or humanitarian aid. The problem, of course, being that, in order to do all of that, there needs to be peace. And that's not always the case in the countries that Canada or other countries are going to be going into. It's more of a combat role, and there's really no peace already assured, like there was, the example of they give of Cyprus, where these two countries didn't want necessarily to go to war with each other, so somebody would step in to maintain peace until a political solution could be reached. Instead, it's going into, for example, failed states where you're trying to build peace, and that can look a lot different than just being a stand between. And then that last question, I don't really have an answer to. Is peacekeeping still an option? That's a question scholars ask. The big debate about peacemaking versus peacekeeping. Are we involved now more in peacemaking? Can we actually be involved in humanitarian aid and addressing humanitarian issues without having the might or the military to back that up? And is there really an appetite or a will in Canada to be sending our troops places, not just to keep the peace, but actually to build peace in a more proactive role? So peacekeeping is certainly one of those issues of Canada and the world that is definitely going to continue to be discussed moving forward. All right, so let's move to the 1960s to the 1990s. There's a lot of things here, but there's kind of one thing that I want to focus on, 1969. Well, 1968, the Canadian International Development Agency, so CIDA, gets established. The idea is that Canada's increasingly funding large aid programs, and there needs to be some sort of coordination, so CIDA is going to coordinate that. And so our buddy Pearson, who we learned about regarding the Suez Crisis, establishes a commission on international development that publishes the report Partners in Development. And it's really encouraging countries to devote 1% of their gross national product to foreign aid. And so the idea being that Canada is going to be this leader in producing foreign aid. Canada's own target is about 0.7% of GNP. And the idea that Canada wants to be this leading country in terms of foreign aid now. Has that remained? There's been a variety of different pushes in different governments regarding what foreign aid should look like for Canada. For Stephen Harper, it was maternal and child health. For Justin Trudeau, it's been very much gender equality issues. And so each government kind of puts their own spin on what foreign aid should look like. The question, of course, being what are the long-term benefits and drawbacks to having these changes, and what foreign aid is going to look like based on the government in question. The last thing I wanted to deal with is this issue of the Rwandan genocide and the responsibility to protect. So we move into the 90s. as we just talked about regarding peacekeeping and humanitarian issues, we're having a lot of debates and discussions about, how much should Canada intervene, or should any country intervene when it comes to situations where we're not maintaining a peace, but actually trying to prevent a all-out civil war from happening, trying to prevent atrocities. And the Rwandan genocide is often seen as kind of that shift and turning point in countries not wanting really to intervene in sovereign states' affairs, but then also recognizing that there is some sort of responsibility to intervene in some cases. So obviously, I'm sure you've read about the Rwandan genocide, but there's ethnic conflict in Rwanda. There's a Canadian general, Romeo Dallaire, who's the head of the UN peacekeeping force. He's told, don't intervene. He tries to alert the international community that a genocide is taking place. He wants more troops to be actively involved in preventing it. The request is denied. Actually 90% of the peacekeeping troops in Rwanda are actually taken out of Rwanda. When eventually more peacekeepers are brought in, especially through the African Union's peacekeeping force, there's really not that much that can be done. And within a very short period of time, hundreds of thousands of Rwandans have been killed. And we all obviously know that that was one example to the international community that, where I guess the big question of, at what point do we have a responsibility to intervene in these sorts of international conflicts? If we are there to just keep the peace, if peace is falling apart, at what point do we intervene, and in what ways should we be intervening? And that's really a question that we're going to have to grapple with for a very long time. So this idea of responsibility to protect comes out of this. Also the Rwandan genocide, but then also the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. And in the 1990s, we start to ask this question. We want to have every country to have political sovereignty, so we're not going to intervene in their domestic affairs, but at what point do we need to intervene? So the responsibility to protect doctrine comes out of this. In 2001, there's a final report on this. The idea is that sovereignty is conditional. So every country has their sovereignty, but at some point in time when they start committing mass atrocities, defined as genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, or ethnic cleansing, then the international community actually has a responsibility to go in and protect the human rights of the people who are living in that country. And that it's the international community together as a whole's responsibility, not just one country. And so this is on the books, but the question, of course, is making those decisions about where you intervene, when you intervene, when's it most appropriate. You can see cases where it might be clear that intervention happened more because of strategic interests rather than a responsibility to protect. And so the question is, how do we understand where it's our responsibility to be involved in, as Canada, where should we be involved in the world? And so that's kind of where I'm going to leave it, because that'll go really well into activity for class on the responsibility to protect. But all tricky subjects, tricky issues, questions that we haven't necessarily completely figured out yet. But clearly kind of dealing with this question of, what should Canada's actions be within the international sphere? So now's the time to head over to the quiz and take a look at that.